Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mindy Pelletier, and I'm the Program Manager for the Center for Undergraduate Research. And welcome to our CUGR Talk today. We have two speakers for you today. We have Brianna Christie and Herakova from the Department of Communication, and we look forward to their talk today. If you do have questions, we invite you to put those in the Q&A feature, and those will be addressed as soon as we can. I give it up to Brianna. Take it away.
All righty. So thank you everyone for joining us again at this CUGR Talk. This is sharing knowledge and creativity with diverse audiences, a webinar. So we're kind of going to do some talking at you, but also looking for your participation in some of this work that we've provided for you today.
And as Mindy said, I'm Dr. Herakova. I use she, her pronouns as well. I see my Zoom tag doesn't reflect that for some reason. And then I got distracted. I didn't change it. And Brianna Christie is a master's student in our department and a public speaking instructor. And we are excited to share with you some tips for presenting your research at the symposium coming up in April. So our goals for today really, given the limited amount of time, are to learn or get a preview of how to analyze elements of a rhetorical situation. I'll explain what that is in order to craft impactful presentations. We're gonna also work towards identifying specific strategies for crafting effective presentations in terms of organization of ideas, learning or familiarizing yourself with your presentation, so it's a more conversational delivery, and then how to engage the audience. So when we talk about the rhetorical situation, you see this on the slide here, this little triangle. It basically reminds us that meaning is not inherent in words. Meaning is made through interaction. And those interactions are in the public speaking context between speaker and audience and the subject matter or the presentation, and then the speaker and the presentation. So the sides of the triangle indicate those relationships. And so when we prepare effective and impactful presentations, we're thinking about all three of those relationships. How do we develop familiarity with our own message, with our own speech, with our own subject, so that it feels like something we do want to talk about, we are passionate about, and we're also knowledgeable about. How do we develop, even within a limited amount of time, knowledge of the audience and kind of relationality with the audience so that they also trust us and trust our credibility? And finally, again, within this limited amount of time, how do we connect the audience to the subject matter that we're talking about? How do we make it relevant to them? And so we're hoping that today we're going to be able to touch on all of these relationships, recognizing again that the presentation at the symposium is kind of a unique context because you're not like us standing in front of the same group of people for an amount of time and presenting a set message, but people would be coming and going, and you would have to go in and out of your presentation at different moments to bring new audience members, new listeners in. So we wanted to start with a little bit of an exercise thinking about how these relationships are present in impactful presentations. And so we're going to watch this 5-minute video. I'll introduce it, and I will invite you to think about the 4 questions listed on this slide, and then we're going to solicit feedback. We would like to hear from you. This probably would come in the chat. I'm assuming as Q&A, that's okay as well. So you can be typing as you are watching. So what is effective in how the research is presented in this particular research talk? What is the problem scientists are addressing and why does it matter? What are the key scenes in the presentation? So here we're trying, instead of thinking about a traditional outline, trying to think about what are those moments that organize how ideas are shared with the audience. And if you had to summarize the presentation in one sentence, what would that sentence be? Maybe we kind of focus on that last one. If you had to put something in the chat, really, what would be your one sentence summary? Now, this presentation is called Deciphering Nature's Secrets, and it's a presentation that recently from UMaine scholars, which we're very excited about to also be able to feature the work of UMaine researchers. But this particular presentation won the 2023 Communication Prize from the International Council of Academies of Engineering and Technological Sciences. So it is recognized through this international body as an example of effective science communication. And it is a 5-minute research talk on a complex topic that nevertheless is presented accessibly for a variety of audiences. And this is kind of like what we're going for as well. So again, we'll play the presentation, and the questions would stay on the screen as well. We're not going to make this full screen, so that if you have any thoughts as the presentation is going along, please feel free to put them in the Q&A.
Bacteria are around us all the time. Most of the time, we don't really notice them because they're way too small to see and they don't bother us. But we've all had an ear infection, strep throat, a UTI. These are things that are familiar across the world. Luckily for us, we have antibiotics. Unfortunately, these medicines are starting to not work as well as they used to. The problem isn't confined to just human medicine. Antibiotics are widely used in raising livestock, where they can go out into the environment and contribute to resistance there as well. These practices are projected to increase over the coming years. So, are we simply doomed to go forward into this future? No. We're human beings. We solve problems, and engineers have a critical role to play here. We are the ones who build new solutions, who take problems like this and discover how we can address it. Think about a natural, beautiful landscape, if you will. And if you really start to think about it, you'll realize that bacteria are everywhere. Yet in these situations, at no point is nature hitting everything with antibiotics across the board. Maybe there is information that we can gain from this, and maybe we can take that information and turn that into solutions for human problems. In our group at the University of Maine, we focus on bio-inspired engineering of materials. And we know that a lot of problems with bacteria really start when bacteria stick to things. So if we look at nature for an example of how nature has solved the infection situation that we're dealing with, maybe our best example is us. If you think about us and the place in our body where nature does the best controlling of bacteria is actually the place where the bacteria concentration is highest, in our intestines. It's all kept in balance when we're healthy. But at a very base level, one of the most important components is mucus. Mucus is an amazing material. At a fundamental level, it's basically just acting as a physical barrier. It is presenting these bacteria with a surface that is soft and moving and flowing and dynamic. So we asked ourselves, what if we just replicated that component? Could we get towards finding that balance that nature achieves? The answer, it turned out, was yes. We could fairly easily create a mucus mimicking system by adding a biocompatible liquid to a very commonly used solid, silicone rubber. And we found that when we did, indeed, we were able to create a mucus-like system. And importantly, we could treat any kind of medical device that was made out of this material. And we were actually able to introduce a fluid dynamic component to that simply in the form of a biocompatible liquid that would get in between those molecules in the material. When we did this, what we were doing was giving that material a mucus-like sort of surface. So in fact, we found that we could treat any type of medical device made out of this silicone rubber material. Urinary catheters are among the most commonly used medical devices. Unfortunately, due to the nature of where they are located, they're also one of the most prone to infection. We sent these materials to collaborators who specialize in catheter-associated urinary tract infections, and the results were jaw-dropping. We found between a 90 and 100% reduction in the bacteria that were able to stick to these materials, grow, and then spread to other organs. We weren't satisfied with stopping there, though. One thing that makes natural materials so amazing is their ability to change and adapt. We used 3D printing to engineer a vascular network within our silicone rubber materials. And we found we actually had created a system that would allow us to communicate with bacteria. So we were able to listen to the bacteria. When they grow and reproduce, they create compounds, and those compounds diffuse down from the surface into a liquid that we use to fill our vascular channels. But it went further than this. We actually found that we could infiltrate those vascular networks with materials that would instruct the bacteria to do specific things. So in this way, we were able to create a communication loop with the bacteria in a way that is approaching how nature handles it. We believe that being able to communicate with bacteria in this way, in real time, is going to give us a new set of tools for being able to look at bacteria as a potential partner in health and well-being for humans. Nature has evolved over millions of years to achieve balance with these organisms, and now we are working to engineer a part of that balance into human materials and processes.
So let's take maybe a minute. We'd love to see some thoughts. Again, you can post them in the Q&A. They can be questions, but they don't have to be. What, if anything, you found effective in this presentation? What are some of the key moments or all the key moments and scenes you identify? What is the research problem? Why does it matter? And or what is your one-sentence summary of this research talk? And both Bri and I are teachers, so we know how to wait the silences. It's a little bit more challenging in a webinar because we're also not really seeing you thinking. But we'll give this about half a minute more. So one that I'm seeing is that the visuals are very, very effective partners for the concepts that may be hard for people to picture otherwise. That is a helpful thing to notice. In your symposium presentations, you will have posters, so a little bit less dynamic visuals, but still you can think about how those visuals could actually complement the verbal message and make it easier to understand, rather than duplicate that verbal message that you would be delivering. Also, that the speaker is very concise and purposeful, prepared to speak. Because I think purposeful is a good word, has a clear purpose. Your research talk should have a clear purpose as well. And then there is a question, maybe, or a comment, which the way I understand it, I'll read it out loud, but the way I understand it kind of gets at something really bigger. So I could use some clarification on this one. The question is, how does this approach, I'm assuming the approach presented in the talk, how does this approach respond to the growing criticism of research programs' reproducibility crisis? And I'm not sure I quite understand what this refers to. That research programs tend to reproduce themselves. This is one crisis that I'm familiar with, or rather than maybe results cannot be replicated reliably. So if you posted this question, I would appreciate some clarification, and then we can address it later on. Yeah, so very important to notice here that again, it's a concise presentation, it's purposeful, and something that and that the visuals support that purpose as well. And something to help us achieve that in an impactful way is to think about not only what we're going to say in our talk, but how we are going to guide our audience, our listeners through that. This is about establishing that relationship between the message and the audience, the story we are telling, the research we are sharing, and the audience. And it's also about establishing the relationship between the speaker and the audience, because you are the guide of the listeners through your presentation. And so the more competent of a guide you are, the more attentive you are to the audience's needs, the higher your credibility as well. And that improved relationship also improves the ability of your listeners to understand. So one of the ways, a key way in which public speaking teaches us how to be effective, competent guides through our presentations is through the use of organization. And we can go on the next slide. We like to think about this, and you can trace this in this talk as well, as really storifying your talk. If some of you have taken public speaking classes, you probably have seen kind of suggestions for different organizational patterns. Here, we like to suggest a little bit of a different approach, really building on one of the most classic ways to organize stories, because in your presentation, you are telling a research story. So this is a 6-scene or a 6-panel storyboard. Exposition, it goes up and down, up and down. It doesn't have to, but this visual represents it this way. Exposition, conflict, rise in action, climax, fall in action, and resolution. And these are kind of the 6 steps. The exposition set the scene. So here in this talk, we had the whole thing about bacteria being all around. A conflict is identifying that problem. In this case, with the research talk, we have antibiotic resistance. And what this also tells us, what the researchers here tell us, is that what attending to antibiotic resistance points at is that the way humans have approached our work with bacteria is to fight them. But the way nature approaches its work with bacteria, or her work with bacteria, is through working with them. So the conflict identified here is around the need for humans to work with bacteria. The rising action, this next element, builds up the audience's interest. In the case of the presentation, here we had this very understandable and accessible and relatable talk about mucus. Now, most of us as just lay people probably think of mucus as something gross, but the way this researcher built up our interest is to show us that mucus was actually nature's way to interact with bacteria. So it relates to that concept. After a rising action, we have climax. That's kind of like when we reach that moment of like, aha. And in the case of a research, it's announcing the solution. In this particular presentation, we have the discovery of technology to adhering mucus-like substance to silicone, and which makes it possible for us to work with bacteria rather than against them. The following action, coming out of that climax, coming out of that aha moment, coming out of that, oh yeah, we've done it, allows us to, in a research talk, visualize applications. So in this particular talk, she gives an example of the use of that technology in catheters. It is not as exciting as like we found the solution to it, but it allows us to imagine how that solution actually works. As audience members, it allows us to kind of ease back out into a different emotional stance. So after falling action comes resolution. Typically, again, in inspiring research talk, this is holding some promise for the future. It usually is tied to the exposition, to setting the scene, and to, again, assuring your audience that the conflict has been solved and there is promise in that. So in this particular talk, it's the portion, the scene about learning to listen to bacteria and creating feedback loops, and how that helps us see bacteria as our partners. So again, in planning how you're going to guide your listeners to your research talk, we strongly encourage you, rather than think about first main point, second main point, third main point, to think in images, to think in those scenes. The main reason for that is that when we think in images rather than in words, when we think in visuals, as one of the comments had mentioned, rather than in verbal signals and trying to memorize those, we can also move across those scenes much easier. We can skip a scene, but know which scene we have skipped and then come back to it as is appropriate. We can forget, for example, or if an audience member comes in at a point where we're talking about mucus and they have missed a whole part about humans' adversarial stance with bacteria, we can catch them up. We can say something like what you might have missed or what you might not know, and then go back to this portion as well. And I see that there are no new comments. So, okay, we can go to the next slide. The next slide is really a way to, so if you, to think about specific steps you can take in organizing your presentation so that one, it guides your listener more smoothly, but two, it also helps you learn your talk. And we like to talk about familiarizing, becoming familiar with your talk rather than memorizing. When we know from public speaking that when speakers memorize their talk, they also tend to get so much more flustered when they miss something, when they feel like they've made a mistake. Being familiar with your talk allows you to move in and out of it in different ways, and it reduces some of that anxiety around making a mistake. Because you didn't really maybe make a mistake, you just have to go back to that place, or you have to go sideways to that place. So 3 tips in thinking about how to organize and learn your talk. The first one, your one sentence, and we really didn't get to this, but one way to think about this particular talk's one sentence is that in nature, bacteria and other organisms work together. Humans should work with bacteria also. The one sentence is your directionality. It's not the same necessarily as a thesis statement. You should have a thesis statement. The one sentence helps you determine what matters, what should be included here. If it's not something that drives towards that one sentence, then it's a distraction and you can omit it from including it in the talk. So if the one sentence of this talk is we should be partners with bacteria, or we should learn how to partner with bacteria, something like, I don't know, even like bacteria in yogurt, I don't know, could be supportive of that, but it could also be distracting. And so we didn't see this here, and we can make decisions about what to include based on that. What you include in your talk should drive towards that one sentence, should in some way support it or speak to it. If not, it's a distraction. The second one, as I already talked about, is to imagine your presentation in images instead of words. Use storyboarding, and you can have a single note card storyboard with images, no matter how well you draw or don't draw. All of us can do schematics that you bring with you to your talk and you have for easy reference. Thinking in images, thinking of those 6 scenes would also make it much easier to be familiar with your talk, rather than, again, trying to memorize, I don't know, 500 words in their exact order. You're only thinking about 6 pictures, 6 photographs, and how they might be placed in relation to one another. And finally, memorize and practice a few pivoting phrases. So this is if you lose your spot or if people come in the middle of the presentation. And we have some examples here, and I mentioned them earlier as well. Things like what you might not know about bacteria or mucus or whatever it is your research topic. Is that, and then you come back to the thing you wanted to say. A surprising fact about, again, your research topic, and or what's most important to know about is, and then you fill in the blank. We can go to the next one.
All right. So to kind of continue some tips when it comes to presenting your work, we're going to focus more on delivery and engagement. So these are just some 3 things that you can keep in mind. I know, for one, as a researcher myself in my field of communication, I have specific jargon or words that are specific to my field. And So when it comes to eventually presenting my work, I want to make sure that the words I use is more accessible to everyone in the audience. So for one, you want to avoid using jargon. And if you don't know already, jargon are words or expressions used by a profession or group that are difficult for others outside of the profession or group to understand. And so you want to avoid using these specific words, especially without explanations or examples, just so that those that you are presenting your work to can understand what you're trying to say or the work that you've done. And so number two, you want to mind the audience, which also goes along with why you want to avoid using jargon. So this allows you to gauge knowledge, understanding, and interest from your audience. And once you learn more about your audience by asking them questions, such as, if they're familiar with your work or familiar with what you're discussing, you can adapt your presentation to fit their level of understanding, which enables engagement and clearer delivery. So because of this, you and the audience are working together to facilitate learning and engagement, which goes back to the rhetorical triangle that Lily discussed in the beginning of our objectives, which is kind of you as the speaker are working alongside your audience to deliver a clear message to gain knowledge. And so lastly, you want to mind yourself. So obviously, you know your work, you are the researcher, you've done this, you've put in so much time and effort, and you are the expert. So you want to be authentically you. And this allows you to know more about yourself and why this research is important to you, which enables effective delivery. And so to kind of continue delivery and engagement, some how-tos. The first one is to audit your own communication. So this goes back to jargon. You want to jargon proof your own communication. So for example, think about when and why do you use jargon and if it's necessary. So something to do to audit your communication and your presentation and delivery is to go through your presentations and possibly highlight any words you might need to explain to those outside of your field and plan how to use them. And so in the next slide, we're going to kind of do an example of this or a trial run. But just to keep that in mind. And then number two is to practice various simple ways of communicating your research. So basically, once you've jargon proofed your communication, try to put this in different scenarios on how you would communicate it to different audiences. So for example, imagine you have to present this work to a group of educated 16-year-olds, or imagine you're presenting to faculty of academics in a field different from your own. So the second one is more plausible for the undergraduate research conference. So think about how you might communicate to different audience members in different fields. And so in sum, how would you go about shifting your delivery and language use for these different audiences? And so we're going to dive into an activity. And so just looking at this slide and these words, are there some that you know right off your hand? Are there some that aren't familiar to you? You don't have to put it in the chat just yet unless you want to, but just keeping these in mind. So ontological, synergies, integration, parameters, variable, autoethnography, STEM, paradigm. So are there some that you know? Are there some that you don't? And just to keep that in mind. All right. And so we're going to pivot into a more longer type of activity, just to think about jargon proofing and creating effective and impactful language. And so I'm going to go back to the last slide, but if you're on your phone, or if you have your phone accessible to you, you can scan the QR code to do a Padlet. If not, you can put this in the chat and we'll read it when the time is up for this activity. And so from the last...
Sorry, you can also use the link on the slide, tinyurl.com/slide CUGR 2024 to access the Padlet.
Okay, is the QR code shared already? It might not be.
Is the what? Sorry.
The QR code, is it shared with audience members?
It's on the screen right now. So if people are on a computer and have their phones, they can scan the QR code or just put the tiny URL link in your browser.
Okay.
And a Padlet is a simple anonymous discussion board. There's a little plus sign at the bottom right hand or in the middle if you're on your phone. And this is how you can add posts to it. And we'll switch to showing it in a little bit.
Yes. So once you get to the Padlet, from the last slide, choose one jargon word or specific term commonly used in your academic field and or your project. And if there isn't one on the slide that relates to your field or your work, think about one. And so from that, think of a metaphor or analogy that can be used to define, explain, or clarify the meaning of this word. And then using this metaphor or analogy, create a sentence you might say to someone who is unfamiliar with your field of study and or project. So I know that that's a lot to digest, and I think there's a question in the chat.
I can share my screen so that we can look at the example on the Padlet and then see if there's any questions before we. QR code is working. Thank you for the person who said that in the Q&A.
Okay, great. And in the Padlet, there is an example already shown. So if you kind of want to model that example, you can do so. So I'm going to just take 30 seconds for everyone to get into the Padlet, and then I'll go back to the previous slide for some of the words. So we're going to take 10 minutes to pick the word, find the metaphor, and then craft your sentence. And then we're going to pivot to Lily's screen so that we can see everyone's post.
In the meantime, if you have questions or you need help, definitely put them in the chat.
And I'm going to change my screen back over.
One thing that I also do want to say, as you might be putting questions in the Q&A, if for whatever reason you don't want us to read your question out loud, please put that in there. We just want to be respectful of you.
And I know a question in the chat was the third question. So the third one is, using this metaphor or analogy, create a sentence you might say to someone who is unfamiliar with your field of study and or project.
And another thing we can do in a Padlet, if you feel so, you'd see me responding to some of the posts that are coming in, but you could also respond, ask a question. So there are interactive ways, even within this format, for us to learn together. There is a good advice in terms of what Bri had talked about earlier, to practice with various audiences in mind. You can literally practice with various audiences. Talk with your friends about your research, talk with professors who might be in another field about your research, and see what are the questions that they're asking.
So let's take about 4 more minutes until 12:40, and then we'll come back and look at them.
There are 3 posts right now. We do have more participants in the webinar, so we really like to encourage you to be brave. It's anonymous. You get some practice in speaking in a language that people of various backgrounds can understand.
All right. So Lily, do you want to share your screen?
Sure.
Okay.
And just because I'm starting to share again, if you still would like to post, please do. We do have a few examples, just like I said, 3 examples, and we'll talk a little bit about them, and then we'll just open it up to any questions that are coming up. Is everyone able to see things okay? Bri, can you tell me if it's
Yeah,
shown?
there's still a little bar, but you can still read the question and the Padlet's coming in.
Okay. I don't know what's up with my screen. Then clearly it wasn't. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anyone that you'd like to start with?
So we do have 4, and I am going to fess up. One of them is mine. So the one that you saw when you were typing your Padlet, that was mine, was autoethnography. And so I wrote that my work uses autoethnography, which is a kind of way to conduct and gain knowledge that uses storytelling of my own experiences related to the subject. And so I just kind of put the term in the sentence while also diving into kind of the metaphor or simile that it is familiar to. Do you have one that you want to address, Lily?
Yeah, I think too with autoethnography, storytelling is a different way to think about it, kind of to bring it to a more understandable way. That's definitely relevant. And I did want to talk about intersubjective knowledge. Again, this is something that it is a thing in our field. And the post says knowledge that is created in a group setting that does not belong to any one individual, but is the property of the whole group. Intersubjective knowledge is a type of social capital. So I wanted to thank this poster too for challenging me to think of what is a possible metaphor, because I could not discern one in the post. And so I did, what are some things we can use to express this idea that knowledge is co-created and co-owned in some way. So I was thinking of possibly a potluck or a community garden, something like this. Again, a visual that would give people a different way to think about a complex term.
So we also have, I need to transcribe the information from the clinical evaluation. Transcribing is writing down words exactly as a participant says them to look for any speech deficits. And I know, Lily, you made a comment about kind of further breaking it down with clinical evaluation and how that might need to be, yeah, like further breaking down for audience members.
So oftentimes we think of jargon as these particular terms, but jargon can also be in terms of practices. And as we become socialized, educated in a particular professional or academic field, we start talking about practices like interviewing or doing clinical evaluations or assessing for speech deficits, or in education, thinking about formative assessments versus summative assessments, for example. And we learn how to do these practices, and we associate the terms with the actions. But people outside of our professional field, it's not only the words, it's the practice itself that's unfamiliar to them. So sometimes just explaining that process would be enough to kind of to make it more accessible and understandable for a person to be able to see themselves and to say like, like, okay, is this like, I'm assuming maybe this person is in communication sciences and disorder downstairs from us, speaking about speech therapy. Not everyone has had a speech therapy, but all of us have gone to a doctor and have had those initial questions. So maybe thinking about a very common experience that people might have had and using that to make sense of these more complex practices and words. And I do want to make a quick comment or question I have about the comments around ontological. I do like this metaphor with the children's stories. This makes me think more about something we refer to as epistemology, which is knowledge and how knowledge is sorted out, whereas we're getting really technical here, but ontology, and those are connected, certainly. So I would be interested in kind of understanding this metaphor a little bit further, but ontology having to do more with what we perceive to be reality or the nature of being. So I think our kind of takeaways from this, Bri, do you want go back to the slides, or maybe just let's give a few seconds to see if people want to take this time to put some questions in the chat or add any comments to the Padlet, and then we can switch back. But I do love the idea of bringing AI or something that really is in the current moment as a way to make sense of your work and of what you're doing.
So I'll switch back to the slides. So we'll just wrap it up. And then if there's any lingering comments, I think someone just put one in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to do our just closing reminders, and then we can address the questions in the chat?
Yeah, we'll do that. All right. So from this talk, a few takeaways would be one, just to think about familiarize yourself with your research and others' reaction to it rather than trying to memorize it. So talk about your research any chance you get and think in images and storyboard your talk. 2, use language that is accessible, accurate, and authentic to your work. And 3, interact with listeners. So think of your presentation as an ongoing conversation, tying back again to the rhetorical triangle. It's all relational. You as a speaker are communicating a message to the audience in order to gain knowledge.
And we hope that our shared experience today together also demonstrates that it can be done in different formats as well. So don't be afraid to ask questions. When people come to ask you questions about your poster and about your research, taking interest in your listeners would also improve their interest in you and your work. And it would give you the tools to adapt. Maybe you don't have to switch up or explain some jargon every once in a while because the person is very knowledgeable. Okay, so the question that was the one that was posted last in the chat was for us to speak more about the process of generating images. Do you mean using visuals to support, that's how I understand it, to support your verbal message? And I don't know, again, when you say generating, maybe my head is still in the AI comment with regards to ontology, because AI can generate images. But when you're thinking about what we typically would call presentational aids, or using visuals to support your message, or bringing some sort of a model to demonstrate how things happen, maybe this is the way in which you bring your audience, your listeners in. Some of the things that you should be considering is that for the most part, your visuals should say something. They do say things. Your presentational aids should say something that is complementary, like I said earlier, to what your words are saying. So either they help us visualize it, it's that they present a metaphor, they help us imagine things, or they help strengthen your message in some ways. So they might be really impactful statistics, for instance, represented in a pie chart or a graph bar versus the actual numbers. Or if there is something that is particularly complex, then helping explain that. Your visuals or your images, or maybe the question is about the process of generating images for your scenes, for organizing. I'll go back to that too. I guess that's another possible way. But as a whole, when you're thinking about designing your research posters, there should be information that people can read on their own. So there is text in there as well to help clarify things and to help guide through the research that you have done. But when you're thinking about the visual aspects of it, those shouldn't be additional words explaining more words. So I think, for a while it was a fad to have word clouds, and those work to some degree, but they are more words on top of more words. So is there something else that can kind of elicit more of an emotional reaction or elicit more questions or desire to learn more and understand better? Because this would promote that audience interactivity. Now, if the question was referring to how to think in images or create those storyboards, I find that one of the most effective ways is literally to imagine a comic strip and then imagine your research fitting into those 4 or 6 panels of a comic strip. And again, I personally cannot draw at all, but I can do stick figures, and that is enough in a comic strip, or just basic outlines of things. And having gone through the process of actually creating those images myself helps me be more familiar with my research, with my talk. When we have done this in class with students, they love to just do Google image search. You can do that. You can map your research with images available in Google as well. I see that people are logging out as well, so I don't know if there are any last questions, but the slides will be shared with you all.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming through. Any parting words from either of you before we sign off? Okay.
Yeah, for the people who are remaining here, I think one of the most important things, again, these are things you can plan, but the one thing you should not forget is to own your work and be yourself. So that aspect of authenticity is really important. Go into that presentation knowing that you're having a conversation about something awesome you did and something that you care about, and let that guide you and let that show to other people rather than thinking in checklists. Here's all the things I have to cover. Think about how you want to talk about what matters to you.
That's great. Thank you both so much for being here today. And again, if anyone still on the call has any questions about the Center for Undergraduate Research or the UMaine Student Symposium, we are available on social media. You can call us, you can email us. We are available whenever you need us for any question you may have. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.